Every night it rises in the east as a red point of light, visible to the naked eye, hanging above the horizon like something that does not belong among the stars. Every culture in human history has named it. Every civilization has watched it. And for most of recorded history, no one could explain why it glowed red, while everything else in the sky did not. Scientists now say it is iron oxide, rust. The surface of Mars is covered in rust, and that is why it is red. That is the official answer. But the Book of Enoch, written over 2,000 years ago, banned by the church, preserved in the mountains of Ethiopia, does not call it a planet. It does not describe a geological formation. It calls Mars by a name that translates from the ancient Ge'ez as the world that was judged. And what the text says happened there, and what escaped before the judgment fell, is not a story about geology. It is a story about what came before us, and why it was destroyed. This is not ancient astronaut speculation. This is the text. This is what it says. If forbidden biblical history is something you cannot stop thinking about once you find it, subscribe now. Every week we read what was removed. The passage we are working with today is preserved in two manuscript traditions that should not agree with each other as precisely as they do. The first is the Ethiopian Ge'ez text held in Aksum, in the restricted archive that outside scholars have not been permitted to examine in full. The section of interest carries a heading in the Ge'ez that translates as "the words concerning the red world and those who departed from it." The second tradition is a fragmentary Aramaic text within the Qumran Cave 4 collection, cataloged in the range scholars designate as 4Q Enoch C, a subseries adjacent to the main Enoch fragments numbered 4Q 201 through 4Q 212, held at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. The 4Q Enoch G fragments are not publicly displayed. What we know of their content comes largely from the research notes of Joseph Milik, the Polish Dead Sea Scrolls scholar who spent 2 decades cataloging the Qumran material for the École Biblique in Jerusalem. Milik referenced the Red World passage in his private correspondence, but excluded it from his 1976 published volume on the Enoch fragments. Florentino Garcia Martinez, the Spanish scholar whose landmark 1994 translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls remains the standard reference, noted the passage's existence in a 1998 academic paper, and described it as requiring a cosmological framework that current scholarship is not prepared to supply. He did not elaborate. He has not returned to the subject in print. James Vanderkam, professor of Old Testament studies at the University of Notre Dame, and co-author of the definitive scholarly introduction to the Dead Sea Scrolls, has written that the Enoch manuscript tradition contains strata of material whose origin and intent remain genuinely unclear, a phrase that in academic writing functions the way yellow police tape functions at a crime scene. It marks the boundary. It does not explain what is inside. George Nicholsburg, professor emeritus at the University of Iowa and among the most authoritative Enoch scholars alive, has written that the cosmological passages of the Enoch tradition, the sections dealing with other worlds, other places, the structure of the heavens, are the most systematically avoided sections of the entire manuscript by Western scholarship. He calls the avoidance a pattern. Patterns have reasons. Now here's where it gets scary. This is not reinterpretation. This is not a modern reader projecting modern knowledge backward onto ancient poetry. What the text says, it says plainly. It reads the way a witness statement reads, flat, sequential, specific, with no apparent awareness that what is being described should be impossible. And what it describes, when you set it against what planetary scientists have confirmed about Mars in the last 40 years, matches with a precision that a writer in the 3rd century BCE should not possess. The text begins with this. The opening verses of the Red World passage describe a place the author calls the first Earth, a world that existed before this one, not in time, but in the order of divine creation. Enoch places it in the heavens, visible from Earth, moving in a fixed path among the stars. He describes its surface as covered in red dust, the color of dried blood. He says it has no rain. He says the air above it is thin as breath at the end of a long climb. He says beneath its surface, water hides in stone, not flowing, not drinkable, locked inside the rock. Mars has no rain. Its atmosphere is less than 1% as thick as Earth's. Its surface is iron oxide, red dust. And in 2018, the European Space Agency's Marsis radar instrument detected a body of liquid water beneath the Martian South Pole, buried under 1.5 miles of ice. The text describes all 4 of those things, in order, in a document over 2,000 years old. But here's what makes this stranger. The text does not only describe the surface, it describes the sky. Enoch says the red world has 2 lights that are not stars. They move too quickly to be stars, circling the world without rest, night after night. Mars has 2 moons, Phobos and Deimos. Both are small, both are fast. Phobos completes a full orbit around Mars in less than 8 hours, so fast that from the Martian surface it rises in the west and sets in the east, moving visibly, measurably, within a single night. No other moon in the solar system behaves this way. Enoch describes exactly this. He uses the word for movement that elsewhere in the text describes a person walking, not a star drifting, something that moves the way a living thing moves, fast enough to watch. That description is not a metaphor, it is an observation. The question is how an observer in the 3rd century BCE made it, and this is where it gets disturbing. The text does not describe an empty world. The passage makes clear, in language that Lauren Stuckenbrook of Ludwig Maximilian University has described in other Enoch passages as startlingly concrete. The red world had inhabitants. They are not named in the Aramaic fragments, but the Ge'ez version gives a collective designation. The text calls them the first ones, or more precisely, those who came before the earth was prepared. The description of their physical form is detailed in a way that most Western translations abbreviate or cut entirely. They are described as tall. The Ge'ez text uses the same word used elsewhere for the Nephilim, the giant offspring of the Watchers. Their skin is described as the color of the world they walked on, red or reddish. Their eyes are described as pale, adapted to light weaker than the sun's full strength. Mars receives roughly half the solar energy that Earth does. An organism adapted to life on Mars, if such a thing existed, would be adapted to dimmer light. The text describes exactly this adaptation, without appearing to understand it as an adaptation. It simply describes what it saw. But the text doesn't stop there. The passage goes further into the physical world itself. It describes a scar in the surface of the red world, a wound in the ground so vast that the text says it could be seen from the position of the stars. The Ge'ez word used is the Great Tearing. Mars has a canyon system called the Valle Marineris. It is 4,000 miles long. It is as wide as the continental United States. It is 7 miles deep in places. It is the largest canyon system in the solar system. The text calls it the Great Tearing and says it was made not by water, but by a force moving through the ground from beneath, which is consistent with the volcanic and tectonic origin scientists have proposed for the Valles Marineris. The text treats it as a feature of significance. It notes that the first ones built near it. The Ge'ez says they built at the edge of the Great Tearing, where the stone shows what is below. The passage connecting the Sidonia structures to the edge of the Great Tearing is one of the verses most thoroughly absent from Western translations of this section. Sidonia sits in the northern lowlands of Mars. The Valles Marineris lies in the equatorial region to the south. The text geography is approximate, but not impossible. The relationship it draws is deliberate. What the text says happened to them is the part that connects everything. The first ones, according to the passage, did not simply die out. They were judged. The Ge'ez text uses the same word for divine judgment that appears in Enoch's account of the flood. The same mechanism, the same authority, the same finality. But where the flood left survivors, the judgment of the red world did not. The passage describes the judgment as a stripping away, something taken from the world itself rather than something added to it. The protective covering of the world was removed, the air thinned, the water retreated into stone. The surface was left exposed to a heat and a cold and a radiation that nothing living could survive. The text does not describe fire or water. It describes a world made uninhabitable by the removal of its shelter. Mars's global magnetic field collapsed approximately 4 billion years ago. Scientists at NASA's MAVEN mission, which has been studying Mars's upper atmosphere since 2014, have confirmed that without a magnetic field, Mars had no protection from solar wind, and that solar wind systematically stripped away Mars's atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years. First, the thick air thinned, then the liquid water disappeared into the rock and ice. Then the surface became what it is today, exposed, irradiated, red, and silent. The text describes this sequence, the order of loss. It calls it a judgment. The scientists call it magnetospheric collapse. The description is the same. Here's what the translators left out. The passage does not say all of the first ones died. A portion of the text, preserved more fully in the Ge'ez version than in the surviving Aramaic fragments, describes a departure. Some of the first ones left before the judgment fell. They descended. The Ge'ez word used is the same word used elsewhere in the Enoch text for the Watcher's descent to Earth in the time before the flood. The two events, the descent of beings from the Red World and the later descent of the Watchers to Earth, use identical language. The text appears to treat them as the same kind of event, the same act, the same type of being. The departure from the Red World did not bring them to Earth in a form the Earth's people recognized immediately. The passage says they arrived changed by the journey, altered by the passage between worlds in a way that made them appear, to the people they encountered, as something neither fully divine nor fully physical. The word the text uses for their altered state is the same word used elsewhere for the Watchers when they first appear to Enoch, beings of fire and form, present but not quite material, visible but not quite solid. The implication the text draws, without stating it directly, is this. The Watchers were not created here. They arrived here, and the place they arrived from has a name, a location, and a color. And every night it rises in the east and hangs above the horizon, visible to the naked eye, and has done so for every generation of human history. In 1976, NASA's Viking 1 spacecraft photographed a region of Mars known as Sidonia. Among the images returned was a formation approximately 2 miles long that bore, in that lighting and at that resolution, a striking resemblance to a human face. NASA dismissed it as a trick of light and shadow. But in the same region, independent researchers identified a collection of formations they designated the Sidonia Complex, a grouping of hills and mesa structures arranged in geometric relationships that mathematical analysis suggested were non-random. Richard Hoagland, a former NASA consultant, published extensive analysis of the Sidonia formations in the 1980s and argued that the geometric relationships between the structures were consistent with deliberate construction rather than natural erosion. Among those structures, researchers identified what they called the DNM pyramid, a 5-sided formation with internal angles matching precise geometric ratios. Natural erosion does not reliably produce 5-sided symmetry. NASA's official position has remained that the structures are natural. Higher resolution imaging obtained by the Mars Global Surveyor in 1998 reduced but did not eliminate the apparent geometric regularity of the Sidonia complex. The images were released. The analysis was not funded. The conversation moved on. The part that shouldn't be possible is this. NASA's MAVEN mission, which has been orbiting Mars and studying its upper atmosphere since 2014, confirmed that Mars's atmosphere is still being actively stripped away by solar wind today, at a rate of roughly 100 grams per second. Principal investigator Bruce Jakosky of the University of Colorado published these findings in Science magazine in 2015. The mechanism is exactly what the Enoch passage describes as the judgment, the protective covering stripped away, slowly, continuously, by a force coming from above. Jakosky's paper describes it in terms of solar wind and magnetic field loss. The Enoch text describes it in terms of divine removal of shelter. The physical process described is identical. What the text calls a judgment, the scientists call a consequence of magnetospheric collapse. The text was written 2,000 years before magnetospheres were understood to exist. The Enoch passage concerning the Red World contains, in its final verses, a description of what the first ones left behind: structures. The text calls them the marks of their dwelling, and describes them as made of stone cut to angles that do not appear in nature. It says these structures will outlast the judgment because stone outlasts everything. It says they will be visible from above to anyone who knows to look, and that their arrangement encodes the record of what happened to the world that bore them. The suppression of the Red World passage followed the same path as every other suppressed Enoch section. The Council of Laodicea in 364 CE removed the Book of Enoch from accepted scripture. The cosmological passages, the sections dealing with other worlds in the heavens, were specifically identified by early church fathers as the most dangerous category of Enoch material. Jerome, around 400 CE, called Enoch's descriptions of the heavens the imaginings of a man who looked up too often and thought too freely. Augustine, in the early 5th century, argued that any text placing divine judgment on worlds other than Earth undermined the theology of human uniqueness and was therefore heretical by implication. Neither man engaged the Red World passage by name. Both built the framework under which it could be removed without discussion. R.H. Charles, whose 1906 English translation remains the standard Western reference, published the Ethiopian Enoch, but the section corresponding to the Red World passage is abbreviated in his English version by a margin scholar's estimate at over 300 words. The gap falls precisely in the verses describing the departure of the first ones and their connection to the later Watcher descent. Charles left no footnote, he made no acknowledgement, he moved on. In 2019, a researcher at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem submitted a grant application to fund a comparative study of the cosmological passages in the Ethiopian Enoch tradition and current planetary science findings on Mars. The application was declined. The stated reason was insufficient scholarly precedent for the comparison. In 2022, an independent journalist contacted the researcher to ask about the application. The researcher responded that his current work had moved in other directions. He did not specify which directions. Now, let me be clear. I am not saying that beings from Mars built the Sidonia structures and then descended to Earth and became the Watchers of the Enoch tradition. I am not saying the text is a literal eyewitness account from a writer who somehow observed Mars from the surface. Ancient documents carry centuries of copying and interpretation. The Ge'ez text has passed through many hands across 2,000 years. But what the text describes, the red surface, the thin air, the water hidden in stone, the two fast moons, the judgment that stripped away the world's protection, the departure of survivors before the final collapse, matches what planetary science has confirmed about Mars with a precision that a writer in the 3rd century BCE should not possess. Each element of the description is independently verifiable. Each element is accurate. The convergence of all of them in a single ancient passage is not something that happens by accident. Mars is still there, rising in the east every night, red and silent, exactly where the text says to look. The Sidonia region is still there, its structures still photographed, still debated, still officially unexamined by anyone with the authority to examine them properly. The Ethiopian manuscript is still in Aksum, the Red World passage still inside it, in the same language it has always been in. Phobos is still orbiting Mars in under 8 hours, rising in the west and setting in the east, moving the way a living thing moves, exactly as the text describes. The judgment fell. The world was stripped of its shelter. The surface turned red. And what escaped before the end descended to a younger world, walked among its people, and left behind the chain of events that Enoch spent his life trying to record and that the church spent 16 centuries trying to bury. The red light in the sky is not a coincidence. It never was.